Agitorium nostrum in nomine Domini. Let's continue with St. Gregory the Great, whose feast day was yesterday. 2 years later, St. Gregory reproved the Archbishop for remissness in his guardianship of a monastery of nuns who had to go about begging for food and paying taxes. So this was St. Gregory having to correct a bishop. They should remain enclosed, and if any person wrong the sisters, they should be punished. Thank you. Januarius should hold councils of the bishops of Sardinia twice yearly for the correction of abuses. A certain judge was oppressing the priests there. Your ministers despise you, wrote the Pope, and while your only concern is simplicity as it appears, discipline is neglected. Let him put aside all excuses, do his work, and fear no one's words. His archdeacon had defied his command to give up living with women. Let the man reform or be unfrocked, said St. Gregory. Furthermore, the negligence of Januarius had allowed some peasants in his diocese to remain pagans. If St. Gregory found any pagans there in future, he would call him strictly to account. Let him have priests ordained for Phociana, where the peasants live like wild beasts, wholly ignorant of the worship of God. Januarius, the bishop, grew worse as he got older. Finally, in the year 599, a man who had displeased him in some way went to Rome to complain that the fiery old prelate had plowed up his crops one Sunday morning before saying Mass. After verifying the facts from Abbot Cyriacus in Sardinia, St. Gregory from a sickbed sent the aggrieved farmer back to the archbishop with a blistering letter in which he said, among other things, quote, "The sinner of 100 years shall be accursed. Such great wickedness has been reported of your old age, that if we had not judged humanely up to this point, we should smite you with a definitive curse. And since thus far we spare your gray hairs, look to it now at last, old man, we exhort you, and refrain henceforth from such levity of conduct and perversity of actions. The nearer you approach death, the more careful and fearful you should be. And in truth, a sentence of punishment was to be hurled against you. But because we know your simplicity with old age, we meanwhile keep silence. For those, however, by whose counsel you have done this, we decree excommunication for the period of 2 months, though they were not to be deprived of viaticum if in the danger of death. But be careful in the future to stand aside from these counsels, lest if you, lest if you be their disciple in evil, who ought to have been their master in good, we no longer spare either your simplicity or your old age." Wow. So I think there's a lot of bishops today who need a letter like this. So this bishop got hot-headed, someone didn't treat him too well, and he went and dug up all his crops one Sunday morning. Why is that so serious a crime?
Well, because one was Sunday and that was considered, that would have fallen under kind of like servile work, correct, Father?
Yeah, one is manual work, true.
So it was Sunday, and then also it was, since the bishop was angry, so then that would have been kind of like an act of revenge, I assume?
Revenge. But what is it? I mean, in those days, you just don't have market basket down the street. You dig up a man's crops, you could starve his whole family. That's what it depends on, right? St. Gregory wrote the foolish old man another severe letter on hearing that he had exacted 100 solidi, that's the coin, the money of the time, from the lady Nereida for the burial of her daughter. So he exacted a huge amount of money to bury this lady's daughter. If this was so, it was a very serious offense, and far from a priestly thing, to demand a price for earth granted to rottenness. Let the Bishop Januarius amend and trouble her no more, especially considering how generous her husband had been to the church. No charge should ever be made for burial. If people offered something for lights, like candles, it might be accepted, but no payment should ever be asked or exacted. And this still holds today true, too. We never demand money for any of the sacraments. I understand in Mexico it's a common practice of the novice order priests. You have to pay money for a baptism. You got to pay money for confirmation. Pay money for this. Pay money for First Communion. And that's an abuse of the clergy. That's an abuse. But people, out of the generosity of their heart, they usually give a donation. That's fine. But it should never be demanded. And we priests of the SSPX and the traditional SSPX since 2012, never do we demand a price. And that might mean for us a big expense. Catch a plane, travel on a bus or a train, get to some place or rent a car, get there to do a burial, and you don't get a dime in return, and not even a sandwich to say goodbye, Father. But we smile and give them a blessing, and life goes on. And St. Joseph supplies some other way to pay for these things. And this does happen. This does happen. So we never demand money for giving the sacraments. And we don't need to worry about that. If you're a faithful priest and you take care of souls and you preach the faith, God will take care of everything else. So this Bishop Januarius was a pretty rotten bishop. He was a scandal. Well, maybe he was good in doctrine, which would make him better than the modern bishops. Because the modern bishops are all weak in doctrine or heretical in doctrine. And that's far worse than being nasty to people. That's far worse. So we need a good pope who will level excommunications on bishops. Like Father James Martin should absolutely be excommunicated. All these heretical bishops excommunicated. Given a chance to recant, given a chance to correct, but if they don't, out and defrock them. That's the only way the church can be cleaned up. And then, of course, all these pedophile cases that are true, of course, not all of them are true. Some of the priests are falsely accused, and the priests suffer. I know a priest who went through this, and he was innocent. He went through the courts and was proven innocent. And he just said, I just take this as my purgatory on earth. But he was banned from saying Mass, and so now I think he lives with his mother saying Mass. So a terrible, terrible thing to happen. And I think Bishop Pell of Australia was also falsely accused. And that was a sad story for him. So some people can falsely accuse a priest. And that's going to be a heavy price to pay before God. It happened in the days of St. John Bosco. After St. John Bosco died, his successor, I think it was Father Michael Rua, his second or third successor, there was a priest falsely accused of misbehavior with one of the boys, by one of the mothers. And it was a scandal, it was a terrible thing, and it turns out the priest was innocent, and the lady finally confessed after some time that she was paid by the Masonic lodges to plant and spread this rumor, to bring shame on the school and try to close it down. And in those days, it would be a huge scandal. Today, people are so used to hearing it, the scandal is kind of calloused. But it is still a scandal, those kind of things. those deep moral perversions. So any priest guilty of these, really and truly, they have to be removed, defrocked, and removed from the apostolate. They have to be. You cannot put souls, especially children, in danger like that. So that's why priests and seminarians too, we have to be careful dealing with the young people. Pat them on the head and they want to hug you all the time, right? They love their priests. So that's fine, but just kind of keep a certain reserve also. And so you don't give any grounds for people to falsely accuse or suspect. So yes, people can misread many things too. So anyway, so today, imagine a Pope cleaning house today. Imagine if Pope St. Gregory was on the throne today. Wow. He would need documents for excommunications about that high off his desk. He would clean house. And he would correct the traditional bishops too for their shameful silence. So he would have a lot of cleaning up to do. With such an archbishop as Januarius, discipline had reached a low point in Sardinia by the turn of the century. The clergy had no respect for their bishop, Januarius, and many busied themselves in secular affairs and services, deserting the church for gain. Idolatry, soothsaying, that's kind of a witchcraft, and all kinds of superstition spread among the people. When lay officers of the church preyed on the peasants, St. Gregory had them supplanted by clerics who could be corrected. But he never found a means of getting rid of Januarius. So it sounds like Januarius might have been good in doctrine. He taught the faith, but he had a hot temper, he was vengeful, he was greedy, he wasn't a good example. And so at the moral level, of course, he didn't descend, obviously he didn't go to the depths of moral depravity, but he was just, angry, vengeful, and, something a bishop shouldn't be. But notice St. Gregory didn't remove him either. So he must have been pretty good on teaching doctrine. He never found a means of getting rid of Januarius, but in the year 604, he heard that the old man would become ill at Mass and stop in his distress so long that he could hardly find the place where he had left off, while people feared to receive Holy Communion from him, lest the consecration be invalid. St. Gregory reassured them on this score, but was deeply concerned, and in the last few months of his own life, he wrote the Guardian of Sardinia, asking to have the Archbishop exhorted privately not to say Mass if he felt his sickness coming on. This is the last appearance of Januarius in the Pope's correspondence. So he wrote a lot to this wayward bishop. Another bishop who gave St. Gregory no slight trouble was Bishop Natalis of Salona in Dalmatia. Bishop Natalis, there's his name. Bishop Natalis of Salona. West Illyricum, who regulated the episcopacy, who regarded the episcopacy apparently as an opportunity to enjoy the good things of this world and to enrich himself and his relatives. In the last pontificate, he had attempted to give some of the sacred vessels and vestments of his church to members of his own family. Prevented from doing so by the protests of the Archdeacon Honoratus, he had determined to get rid of so troublesome a fellow, and had ordered him in a synod to become a priest against his will, hoping to pack him off to some distant part of the diocese. The deacon Honoratus had appealed to Pope Pelagius II. St. Gregory found the problem waiting for him when he became pope. he attacked it with his usual vigor. He writes, From many coming from your city, dearest brother, he wrote Bishop Natalis, I have learned that neglecting your pastoral care, you are occupied solely in feastings. He would not have believed this, he added, if he had not had ample evidence of it. He perceived that Bishop Natalis did not read, since he was ignorant of ecclesiastical order and etiquette, paying no respect to those above him, for he had ignored letters from Pope Pelagius II and from St. Gregory himself. His attempt to have the deacon Honoratus ordained a priest was obviously a cunning trick to degrade him under pretext of promoting him, and to call in another who would fall in with the bishop's careless way of life. Let him restore the subdeacon to his post at once, or forfeit his pallium. The pallium is the mark of a bishop. If you persist, you are deprived of participation in the body and blood of the Lord. St. Gregory threatened also to remove him from the episcopate. So he was a partying bishop. And you know what that means. Probably a lot of drink and a lot of drunkenness, scandal of being drunk, maybe too loose with the ladies. Bishop Natalis had the effrontery, the boldness, the audacity, to write a jocose defense, whose details must be inferred from St. Gregory's replies. So he made a joke of everything. It was true that he enjoyed feastings, but so had holy Abraham when he entertained the three angels. He rejoiced in being called a glutton along with the world's creator. His banquets were acts of charity, which the Pope had no call to criticize, for St. Paul said, "Let not the abstainer condemn the eater," Romans 14:3. If Bishop Natalis did not read, it was only because he had so many tribulations. Besides, he says, it was not necessary for a Christian to read, for the Lord said, "When they deliver you up, be not anxious about how or what to speak, for it shall be given you in that hour what to speak. For it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father who speaks in you." Matthew 10:19. So here's this bishop justifying himself, quoting scripture. It's quite funny. Nevertheless, he did know the degree of ecclesiastical ranks, and he would send a representative with Honoratus to submit the case to St. Gregory's judgment. He felt aggrieved, however, that the Pope had felt it necessary to add articles of excommunication to his last letter. Having won his main point, moreover, St. Gregory could afford to overlook the flippancy with which he had been addressed, and he wrote a reply in a very similar vein, concealing more than one delicate reproof, however, under playful and tactful phrases. Certainly he would not blame Bishop Natalis for feasting, if, like Abraham, he entertained angels. Charitable feasts, indeed, were praiseworthy, and charitable they would be if there was no backbiting, no deriding of absent persons, no idle secular tales, no pampering of the body, but sacred reading and temperate refreshment. If Natalis was really called a glutton falsely, as the world's creator was, because our Lord was called, remember, he was called a glutton because he ate with St. Matthew's friends, he truly bore the reproach along with him. But if it is true of you, who can doubt that it was false of him? As for the Archbishop's knowledge of the degrees of ecclesiastical rank, I also know all about them with regard to you, retorted St. Gregory. Hence I grieve very much. If you knew the order of things regarding me, you have transgressed, knowing it, which is all the worse. However, since the Archbishop had returned to a proper frame of mind, nothing more would be said. The Pope would hear the case and would blame or acquit Honoratus as the evidence dictated. If the Lord Natalis acts as he should do, I cannot but be reconciled with him, to whose affection I know myself to be so greatly a debtor. When St. Gregory heard 2 years later that the jovial archbishop had gone to his accounting before the awful judge, of whom he had warned him, he wrote the subdeacon Antoninus prompt instructions for the election of a successor. There must be, above all, no bribery or influence of any sort. The new bishop must be free and under no obligations to anyone, and he must be a man of worthy life. St. Gregory was delighted to hear that the clergy of Salona had elected the good subdeacon Honoratus. He summoned to Rome a certain Bishop Malchus, who had tried unsuccessfully to influence the election. When Bishop Malchus died there, after being censured, some priests in Dalmatia did not scruple to accuse the Pope of having had him murdered. These are all documented, these quotes, with the letters and their number. The election of Honoratus as bishop, far from ending the unhappy dispute, was made into an excuse by certain Dalmatian bishops for a test of strength against St. Gregory. They expelled Honoratus from his new post and intruded in his place one Bishop Maximus, illegally elected. St. Gregory replied in May 594 with a stern letter to all the bishops of Dalmatia, asserting his rights as successor to St. Peter. Quote, "Since your ways have been so perverted by secular concerns that, forgetting your responsibility as priests and all sense of heavenly fear, you study to achieve not what may please God, but what may please you, as we have held it necessary to send you these especially strict orders in writing, whereby we warn you, with the authority of Peter, Prince of the Apostles, not to presume to lay hands on any person whomsoever in the city of Salona by way of episcopal ordination, without our consent and permission." Should they do so, he would deprive them of participation in the body and blood of the Lord. That is, forbid them to say Mass. And no one whom you ordained shall be regarded as a bishop. To Maximus, St. Gregory wrote another terse letter, accusing him of living an evil life, of buying his way into the priesthood, and of being foisted upon the see of Salona by military force, after St. Gregory had forbidden this under pain of excommunication. He was not validly consecrated, and if he persisted in his wicked attempt, quote, "May you be abhorrent to God and to blessed Peter the Apostle, the Prince of the Apostles, that your punishment may prove an example to other Catholic churches in contemplating your judgments." So even in these days you had invalid consecration of bishops. So, today we have to deal with the Tukline, which is very iffy. The Tukline is iffy, very iffy, especially when the bishops don't pronounce the words correctly. And, you have a danger of invalidity. Very, very grave. And Bishop Titian Mallory in 2005, he wrote an article in the Angelus magazine, one of his conferences, that the episcopal consecration of bishops of the Novus Ordo are at least doubtful. The Emperor Maurice, on learning from St. Gregory that Maximus had bribed his exarch, Romanus, to permit him to be ordained, ordered the intruder not to say Mass. So the emperor steps in and forbids this Bishop Maximus to say Mass. Bishop Maximus retaliated by having St. Gregory's letters publicly torn up and sent a cleric of Constantinople to repeat the charge that he had had Bishop Malchus put to death in prison for money. St. Gregory felt it necessary to have his nuncio Sabinianus inform the emperor that is, as for the tearing of the letters, quote, you know what my disposition is, that I am prepared to die before I let the church of blessed Peter the Apostle degenerate in my days. Moreover, you know my habits well, and how long-suffering I am. But once I decide to endure no more, I go joyfully against all dangers. The nuncio was to tell the emperor that if St. Gregory had been willing to have anything to do with the death of Lombards, there would be no kings or dukes left among them to disturb the peace of Italy. But since I fear God, I dread having anything to do with the death of any man. Malchus had not been in prison or in any distress. He died suddenly in the night after going, without St. Gregory's knowledge, to the house of a notary. These are all documented letters. Since evil is usually more noisy than good, it is easy to get an exaggerated view of abuses in the church from the letters of popes long dead. For every bad bishop reproved by St. Gregory, there were many other good ones, to whom he seldom, if or ever, found it necessary to write. Of the 60 saints revered by the whole church in the 6th century alone, not to mention the many Irish ones, 19 of them were bishops, most of them French. Saints sat on the seas of Amiens in France, Rheims, Paris, Rennes, R-E-N-N-E-S, Vienne, Angers, Lyon, Verdun, Tours, Trier, 2 of them at Arles, 2 at Rouen. Saint Prix of Rouen so angered Queen Fredegund by preaching to her that she had him murdered. Saint Germanus of Paris, after converting and healing King Childebert, entered upon a long struggle with his worthless sons, especially Chilperic, the French Nero, by whom he tried to make peace between Fredegund and Brunhot. There was an extraordinary flowering of sanctity in France in the first 2 decades of the 7th century. Saint Sulpice of Bourges reformed his clergy and gave such an example of Christ-like love that he converted all the Jews in his diocese. Wow, that's quite an accomplishment. Saint Sulpice. Saint Bertram of Le Mans won the favor even of the wicked Fredegund, the queen. Saint Owen, blessed in childhood by Saint Columban, was chancellor to King Dagobert I and spiritual father to many saints. Saint Owen. Saint Desiderius, Bishop of Vienne, was murdered on his way home from a sermon in which he dared to preach on chastity before that strange mixture of lust and piety, Queen Brunhot. 42 bishops of that century, besides the many in Ireland, Scotland, and England, are venerated as saints, 21 of them in France alone. Among the lay saints were Saints Pepin of Landen, mayor of the palace of Clotaire II, and Dagobert I. His wife, Blessed Ita, his daughter, Saint Gertrude of Nivelles, and his daughter, Saint Bega, mother of Pepin of Hersetal, and the grandmother of the great Charles Martel. St. Gregory had not a little to do with this glorious side of the chaotic 7th century, not only through his energetic reforms, but through the ceaseless attention he gave to the development and supervision of the monastic system, the instrument by which the church finally tamed the barbarians. We find him rebuking Abbot Eusebius for pride, insisting that wandering monks, victims of the barbarians, must be housed and disciplined, protesting to the emperor against a law prohibiting soldiers and imperial officials from becoming monks, because they were calling monks into the draft for war. And it was St. Gregory who stepped in and said, no, you do not draft monks and seminarians. Insisting repeatedly that monks and nuns must be free to choose their own superiors, and must not be bullied or exploited in any way by bishops or other ecclesiastics, making himself the champion of a slave girl who wanted to be a nun and obtaining her freedom, decreeing in a letter to the abbess Thalasis that, quote, no king, priest, judge, or secular person should touch her monastery or its goods under pain of excommunication. When the 3,000 nuns of Rome were suffering from cold and privation, he spent part of the money sent him by the emperor's sister for the poor to buy them bed clothing in addition to their annual stipend from the estates of St. Peter. The dialogues of St. Gregory the Great are scattered with tales of monks and nuns, some evidently written for moral effect. There is, for example, the account of, quote, a certain nun, though she was chaste of her body, yet had she an ungracious and foolish tongue, which departing this life was buried in the church. The keeper whereof, the night following, saw her, by revelation, brought before the holy altar, where she was cut in 2 pieces, and the one half was burned in the fire, and the other was not touched at all. There were marks of fire on the marble of the altar next day, by which we may plainly see that such as have not their sins pardoned can reap small benefit by having their bodies after death buried in holy places. Dialogues, Book 4, Chapter 51. The great conflict in St. Gregory's life, the one whose logic drove him finally toward the policy which was to change the course of history, was forced upon him in 594, the 5th year of his pontificate, when John the Faster, Patriarch of Constantinople, again laid claim, as he had under Pelagius II, to the title of, quote, universal or ecumenical bishop. So John the Faster, remember him? John the Faster?
Yes.
To the emperor and other Byzantine-minded persons, this seemed only a matter of terminology. To St. Gregory, it indicated a new attack on the primacy of Peter, the very rock on which the church had been founded. So you see, even in St. Gregory's time, there's always that tension with the East, with Byzantium. There's always that tension, and there are always these pompous, conceited, wealthy, pains in the neck for the church. So that's why I say that part, the Constantinople is modern-day Turkey in that it's right on the ocean. So it's just California forever. It's perfect weather, perfect abundance of fruits, flowers. It's just perfect weather. They never have freezing cold, never have, well, probably hot in the summer, but maybe not the humidity as in Rome. So for whatever reason, there's always been this friction. And it exploded in 1054 with the schism of the West. So anybody who joins the schismatic church, they are truly schismatics. They're broken off from the Catholic Church. Can they be saved in the schismatic churches, Orthodox churches?
No.
No, they can't save their soul. It's not possible. But God will judge, those who don't know better. But the ones who do know better are the bishops and priests. So St. Gregory will defend the primacy of Peter against John the Faster. John the Faster wanted to take the title, I'm the universal bishop. But only one has the title universal bishop, and who's that?
The Pope in Rome.
The fundamental character of that doctrine was indicated by the very ferocity with which the enemies of the church had attacked it persistently for 5.5 centuries, and the stubborn courage with which all the popes, even the least heroic, had defended it. During the 3 centuries from the time of St. Peter to the Council of Nicaea, that is to say, from Nero to Constantine. The Caesars had attempted to crush the vicars of Christ by brute force. After Constantine, with rare exceptions, they had sought to beguile them, subvert them, corrupt, seduce them, maneuver them by any means into a subordinate position. Against this more subtle attack, the popes had stood firm to the last man. Intrigue, calumny, exile, imprisonment, death itself. No threat or danger could ever break the determination of that magnificent succession of saints never to betray into the hands of Caesar what belonged to God. Whatever their weakness as men, whatever their errors in policy or discipline, not one of them ever failed, even when beaten to his knees by persecution, to stand on the rock and to speak what the Holy Ghost commanded. It was as if the first pope had been permitted to deny Christ before his consecration as a warning to all his successors. So you see, the enemies of the church have always been trying to bring the pope down. And now they got into his head, modernism, which is the worst. Nicaea had been a major victory of the papacy over the whole world. A second important milestone had been the universal acknowledgement of the primacy of Pope Leo the Great, even by 2,500 Eastern bishops. After the Patriarch of Constantinople, Anatolius, had sought at the Council of Chalcedon to undermine it. The struggle then continued under the saintly successor of Pope Leo. Even Theodora's creature, Vigilius, had said, "You may bind me, but you cannot bind Peter the Apostle." And now in a third crisis it devolved upon St. Gregory, with all his other cares and conflicts, to defend the same holy cause, even if it cost his life. He had already had one lesser difference with John the Faster. In the year 592, the Patriarch had found two priests, Father John of Chalcedon and Father Athanasius of Isauria, who was also a monk, guilty of heresy, and had had the latter beaten with cudgels in his cathedral. The two went to Rome to appeal to the Pope, who wrote John the Faster a letter of inquiry. The Faster replied that he knew nothing about the matter. St. Gregory penned one of his sarcastic letters, saying that he had written his most holy brother, but had had no reply. Instead, some secular person had written in his name, professing ignorance. That familiar of John the Faster, the Juvenculus, must be the same who knew nothing about God or charity, who daily laid snares for human beings. If such things could happen to servants of God without John's knowledge, what could be more scandalous than such ignorance when he was so near? And if he did not know, what could St. Gregory reply but the words of Scripture, "The mouth that lieth slayeth the soul"? St. Gregory did not wish to quarrel, but he would not shun it if John the Faster forced it upon him. "We were made pastors, not persecutors," he wrote. So John the Faster, now a bishop, he got to his head, didn't it? So he fasted much, but he was cruel to people. In the end, John the Faster finally yielded, accepting the judgment of the Pope, who exonerated one of the priests and exacted from the other a retraction of certain statements at variance with the teachings of the Church. Okay, so we'll pick up. There's more of John the Faster to come. So he must have a headache for Pope Gregory. Agitorium nostrum in nomine Domini.